Okay, welcome to the class 16 video on memory. This class video will work the same way the last one did. For this class, we had a reading from Southworth and Swire and a set of exercises that were also from Southworth and Swire. And as before, I'm going to run through the important parts of the content of that reading that I want you to know, and we'll hit some exercises during the video as they come up. But if you're in the online section, you may have already done all of them, or you may be doing them afterwards. It's really up to you how you want to do them. Okay. So the central lesson of the last class was just that perception is like inductive inference in that it goes beyond the information given and is context dependent. So we think of perception as simply delivering us the unvarnished truth. Here's reality. You just saw it with your own eyes. But that's not the way perception works. In fact, perception involves a lot of reconstruction of what you think should be out there from an imperfect two-dimensional upside-down image on the back of your retina. And this process of reconstructing what you think should be out there looks a lot like inference. It goes beyond the information given, it's context dependent. And, this is a common cause of all kinds of misperceptions. You don't see things that you don't think should be there. So again, perception is like inductive inference in that it goes beyond the information given and is context dependent. So what's the lesson for this class? Memory is like inductive inference in that it goes beyond the information given and is context dependent. The same lesson we had from the previous class is going to be true of this class. You think of memory as simply delivering you the whole unvarnished truth, but in fact, memory is constructive and reconstructive. You piece together what happened based on imperfect traces and a process that looks a lot like inference. So the first exercise was one that I added to the set just to make it more parallel to the previous set of exercises. So in the previous set of exercises, it opened by asking you to remember a time that you misperceived something and then try and figure out why you misperceived it. I want to do the same thing this time. Think of a case where you remembered something one way, you were certain it happened that way, but later evidence showed that it didn't happen that way at all. Write a paragraph describing that situation and include a discussion of the factors that might have led to the faulty memory. This is going to serve the same role the previous exercise did, give you sort of an emotional mental anchor for all of our discussion of the way memory works this time. To see how memory can fail. So if you haven't done that exercise, pause now and go ahead and do it. If you have already done the exercises, we can just move forward. So our first subsection is going to be about how memory works, and the second section is going to be about biases of memory and how to deal with them. So the central lesson here is that memory is active. We are constantly filling in the gaps in our memory. And again, this means that the process of remembering looks a lot like inference. The lesson of class 16 was that perception is like inference. The lesson of class 16 is that memory is like inference. And what this means is that we need to use our critical thinking skills to evaluate our memories, the same way we need to use them to evaluate our perception. If something is working like inference, then you can apply the skills of critical thinking to be sure you're doing it well. So one way of thinking about it is that there are two models of memory, two ways of understanding the way memory works. There's the static model of memory, and there's the reconstructive model of memory. For the static model of memory, we imagine that memory is like a video recording. It appears the same way each time you play it back. all of the information is in the recording, and all you do is you scroll back on that little bar and you go back and it's just the way it was before. On the reconstructive model of memory, memory is active. We are constantly filling in the details using a method that looks like inference. We rewrite our memories each time we remember them. So remembering something periodically will help reinforce it, keep it from being lost forever. But also each time you do it, it's like making a copy of a copy. You introduce more imperfections, and you are constantly reinterpreting events so that they make more sense to you. They introduce all of your biases. So most people think that memory works like the static model of memory, but really memory is reconstructive. It works like the active model. Okay, so your reading breaks memory down into 3 stages: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding happens when we first perceive something, and then some trace of that gets recorded in our brain, gets encoded somewhere in our brain. And it's not the full image, it's just some kind of trace. Storage is the time between encoding and retrieval. And storage is not static. Storage involves a lot of elaboration and revision. As your memory sits in your brain, it gets rearranged, mostly so that it makes more sense to you. And retrieval is what happens when a memory is activated, and that this can be recall or recognition. Recall means you yank the whole thing out of your memory. Recognition means that you see something and then you realize that it matches what's in your memory. So an obvious question to ask here is, when do errors happen? And you know from the reading that, in fact, errors happen at every stage. Encoding happens with perception, which means that it's biased by your perceptual set. Reconstruction introduces errors because you are always storage introduces errors because you are reconstructing your memory in a way that has it make more sense. Retrieval is biased by the context of retrieval. So let's look at these 3 in detail. Encoding. Encoding, when you first record some scrap of what you perceive, is biased. And what's important here to note is that biased encoding combines with the bias we talked about in the previous class, perceptual set bias, to create a distorting feedback loop. Remember when we were talking about perceptual sets, we saw that what you see is based on expectations. And psychologists can play around with that with a process called perceptual priming, where they push you to see one thing, and therefore you interpret what you see that way. And this was done with a very simple image of a figure that could either be a 13 or a B, right? And depending upon how we arranged the images around it, you interpreted it as one way or another. So perceptual set bias creates a bias in what you perceive. That creates a bias in how you encode. So think about how these work together. You have perception. Perception leads to biased encoding. That leads to a memory. And what does your memory do? Memory serves as the basis for perceptual set bias. So you get a cycle where things are, your memory and your perception reinforce each other, create a world that matches your expectations, that makes sense to you given what you already believe, and is insulated from evidence that your basic understanding of the world is false. All right. Storage is biased. So we constantly edit our memories so that they make more sense. And again, this process looks like inductive inference, although some of the examples that Southworth and Sawyer give aren't really so much inductive inference as they are like compression. So here is one example. In a test, subjects were given two sentences. They were given a bunch of sentences and asked to remember them. Two of the sentences were, the ants ate the jelly and the ants were in the kitchen. These got compressed in their memory to, the ants ate the jelly in the kitchen, which isn't necessarily true given the existing sentences, right? So again, the way your memory is stored creates biases. Okay. Another important thing to think about here is the idea of a schema. A schema is a well-organized packet of generic knowledge about a common or well-known situation that is used to fill in the details of memory. And the example that Southworth and Sawyer give is that the image of a picnic, right? If I ask you to picture a picnic, you probably imagine, if you grew up in the United States, like a wicker picnic basket and maybe a checkered blanket that you sit down on, and maybe you're on a date. Or maybe if you're my age, you remember the old Yogi Bear cartoons where the bear tries to steal the picnic basket. Actually, I'm not sure how many people actually go on picnics that look like that schema. It's not so much a schema from experience, it's a schema from our culture. But in any case, we use that to fill in details of our memories. So if we just remember something about a basket, we will fill in the image of a typical picnic basket from this schema. So it's important to remember that schemas are necessary for memory. The way memory works, this is inevitable, but they can also contain harmful stereotypes. And because, like with the picnic example, these aren't always derived from experience, they're derived from the larger culture and all of its prejudices. These include race, gender prejudices, ability prejudices, all of those. Biased retrieval. The context that we recall something in affects the content of the memory. So it's not just, what was going on when you put down the memory trace. It's also what you are doing when you retrieve the memory that affects what it is you think you remember, right? And a lot of this comes from what we call a framing effect. And actually, we've talked about the framing effect in other contexts. Anchoring counts as a kind of framing effect in some ways, anchoring bias. In this case, we're just talking about it in terms of the framing effect of recall, right? So if you ask someone to remember something, the way you phrase the question will have an impact on how it is remembered. So a simple example that the reading gives is about a movie. If you ask, how long was the movie? You will get a slightly different answer than if you ask, how short was the movie? And again, this is the kind of finding that actually Kahneman and Tversky's original research was all about. And so there have now been decades of research where people just, change the wording of questions in order to and see how it affects the answers. This is, again, not just true of memory. It's true, very importantly, about political polling. how you phrase question on a poll impacts what the results are. And so this is a way that you can actually sneak information or propaganda into your poll. You can say things like, so what do you think about the fact that President Biden's son is a corrupt sellout of America, right? You bias the question, you bias the answer. The same thing applies to memory. Um, It's not just questions, though. It is the context overall that you're in and the state that you're in. So it is easier to remember something if you are in the same context and or physiological state that you were in when the event happened. The easiest thing to do here is to think about the incredibly commonplace experience of getting up from your chair, walking to another room, and forgetting why you walked into that room. And I know this doesn't just happen to people my age, though it certainly happens more. Wait, what was I doing? So you walk back to the room where you were before, and then suddenly you've got these perceptual cues. And these perceptual cues remind you of what you were doing, right? And I know I do this just like the computer version of this. I will open a file and I'll forget why I opened it. So I go back to the file I was working on, and then suddenly I remember because I have that sensory cue. So the if you try to remember something, it's good to have the cues, the senses that were around when the sensory input that was around when you put down the trace of that memory. And this is also true for physiological states. So if you are excited when something happened, it might also that memory might come back more readily if you are excited when you try to remember it, or if you are sedate, same thing. Okay, so the example is from a study by Elizabeth Loftus, no relation, she spells her name differently, and her coworkers. She did a lot of work on memory, and especially a lot of her earlier work is extremely influential in understanding police testimony, eyewitness testimony in courts. Um, there's some criticism of her work out there as well. I don't want to get into the details of it, but the kind of thing we'll be looking at here is all pretty well replicated. So you ask a question. You imagine you're a police investigator arriving at the scene of a car crash. You say, how fast were the cars going when they blanked each other? If you say contacted for that blank, they weren't going that fast. If you say smashed, they were going faster. So again, the way the question is worded affects the way people answer it. And I got to say, I spend a lot of time worrying about this when writing test questions as well, right? Um, you've got fine details of wording can be extremely important. All right, so this brings us to the next two exercises in the exercise set. First one says the way we word questions may affect the way we remember things. Give two examples of different ways of wording the same question that might elicit different memories. And also, how can you test whether your questions really did this? This is the key scientific element, right? If you're thinking about how you can test something, you're bringing scientific reasoning into it, and that's always a good thing. So, yeah, that's the first question. Just come up with one of your own examples of the phenomenon we've been talking about. The second question from this section, Ria was walking home last night after a few too many drinks. They see someone who may just have broken into their neighbor's house, but can't remember much about the burglar. Under what conditions might they be more likely to remember? Again, this is applying some of the ideas that we saw before. If you've already answered these questions, we can just move along. If you haven't, stop a second and answer them. Okay, now I want to talk about biases and solutions. And actually, we've already been talking about biases all along when we've been talking just about how memory works. But now I want to dive in a little deeper on biases and also talk about, well, solutions here is just going to be the little section that Southworth and Sawyer have on memory and study techniques, which is obviously relevant for you guys. All right. False memories. First term from the review sheet for this section. It's not that complicated. False memories are just memories that aren't accurate, right? Makes sense. The important thing to see here is that false memories don't work the way we think they do, right? This is the key. And one easy and important takeaway is that the vividness of a memory does not correlate with the accuracy of a memory. You can remember something like it was yesterday, but that doesn't mean it actually happened. And there's no correlation here either way. There are vivid memories that didn't happen. There are vivid memories that did happen. There are not very vivid memories that didn't happen. There are not very vivid memories that did happen. Vividness is uncorrelated with accuracy. So it's in this context that Southworth and Sawyer talk about what they call flashbulb memory. So this is just a memory of an emotionally heightened event. When things are emotionally heightened, it can improve your memory. It can also distort your memory. The emotional weight that you put on a memory may not have originally been there. It may have been applied later. The vividness of your memory and your confidence in it do not correlate much with accuracy. And in this context, they talk a lot about memories of trauma, which can be suppressed, but they can also be implanted. And I think they do a pretty good job of just recognizing that both of these things happen. Elizabeth Loftus, so back in the 80s, there was a series of witch hunts claiming that there were, in the US and Canada, claiming that daycares were actually being run by Satanists who sacrificed children to the devil. And then kids would come forward and say, yes, I saw a kid at my daycare be sacrificed to the devil. These were obviously false stories, and the memories were implanted on the kids. It's actually really easy to manipulate kids into saying things, right? The longest someone was ever incarcerated on false charges happened here in Cleveland. There were 3 guys falsely imprisoned for murder. And the testimony was all based around the testimony of an 11-year-old boy that the police interrogated in a way that implanted memories. This is covered in a book called Good Kids, Bad City, which I recommend highly. And they didn't just harm the lives of the people who were falsely imprisoned. The boy became an alcoholic out of the guilt over the whole thing. All right. All this to say, flashbulb memories are not more reliable. They're also not less reliable. I'm just saying don't rely on bad indicators as a sense of, for your sense of accuracy. All right, false memories. Some just notes. False memories can feel just like real memories. If someone says they remember something, if someone else says they remember something, we often form a false memory of it. This is actually an easy way to get false memories into other people's brains. Oh, you remember the shooter was wearing a blue hat. Don't you remember that? And you say that, and that memory actually gets implanted. False memories can be formed by imagining events. If you ask someone to mentally recreate a crime scene repeatedly, they can actually generate false memories based not on what happened, but on how they are recreating it. And this is again something that is done entirely using their own biases, the biases that come from society. And so, again, false memories of crime scenes will often insert minorities in there where they weren't there previously. And we all create false memories to preserve our self image. When we remember something, we remember it in a way that makes us look better. Okay, it's in this context that Southworth and Swire talk about a phenomenon called belief perseveration, which is an awkward phrase. This is another thing that doesn't apply only to memory, but it's well worth talking about now because you got to talk about it sometime. It's a very important part of the way that human beings are systematically irrational. So, belief perseveration is a tendency to continue to believe something even after our original reason for believing it has been undermined or shown to be false. So, if you have a false memory, you will continue to believe that even after your memory has been shown to be false. And I think it's easiest to understand this process again by returning to the idea of argument, looking at argument. So, perseveration in 3 steps. Step 1, you believe something based on evidence, right? And so this is just how evidence works. You believe some premises, and then you make an inference, and that leads you to believe the conclusion, right? Well, step 2, what happens if the premises turn out to be false? You believed them, but they're not true. So the premises go away. You're left with the conclusion. Step 3, you still believe the conclusion, even though your original evidence for that conclusion is gone. So here's an example, one that I've seen play out in my lifetime. If Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, the invasion of Iraq is justified. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, therefore the invasion of Iraq is justified. The nation is convinced to go to war on the basis of some evidence. But the evidence turns out to be false. Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. So the premises go away. And people continue to believe in the conclusion. All right. Last 2 bits of vocab about memory that I think these are just the last 2 that I want you to remember are things that I've already mentioned. This is the primacy effect and the recency effect. It's pretty straightforward. If you're remembering a chain of events, the first item influences us more than the later ones. This is also a part of the anchoring effect. But when it comes to memory, it means that the first item in a list is remembered more than the other items in the list. The recency effect says that the later items are also remembered more than the ones in the middle. So this is a lesson that I always give when I'm teaching writing. The beginnings and the ends of things are what stick out in people's mind. If you want your reader to remember something, put it at the beginning of the paragraph or the end of the paragraph, or the beginning of the essay or the end of the essay, even the beginning of the sentence or the end of the sentence. That's what stands out. Okay. So there are additional exercises, and you need to do all of those. There was one more that I added because I noticed that the chapter summary, section 8.12 of the reading, actually doesn't just look like, it's an argument. see the words hence and because. So in fact, you can reconstruct this chapter summary as a argument in standard form. So that was one of the other exercises that I asked you to do. And one more thing is Southworth and Swyer's ways to improve memory. And this is all in a classroom context, really. Be active. I'm literally cutting and pasting their section headings here. You remember things you interact with, not things you absorb passively. And integrate the material with what you already know. So this has application specifically in the classroom. You want to be active and you want to integrate what you're doing with what you already know. That's why, so they say, sit up front, take notes. It's true. It also helps to be thinking about how what you're just learning applies to what you already know, which is why we've got all these exercises that begin, can you remember a time when you had a false memory or had a bad perception? This helps integrate your new knowledge with the knowledge that you already have. Southworth and Swyer say don't rely on recordings. I want to back off a little bit on that because that might be considered ableist. Plenty of people require recordings. But we could say don't rely on recordings if you don't have to. Certainly a note that you write down yourself is going to stick with you more than something that you record on your phone. There are ways to integrate the two. I sometimes, for meetings, I'll have a recording of a meeting, and I will take notes from the recording. I'll have notes that I took during the meeting, and then I'll watch the recording and integrate that with my notes. And this is really intense, and it's for important things, but it's a good classroom technique too. Another thing is about reading, and I also recommend this as well. Read items repeatedly with increasing attention to detail each time. Skim it, then read it closely, then read it even more closely. Sometimes when I'm reading things, and again, this might seem pretty intense, but this is just how I do things. I do a first reading on an audiobook while I'm walking my dogs. You've already met Cupcake. I have another dog, Sprinkles. And then when I get back, I read it again on a PDF file, and I take notes that time. This is again for things that's important, not just like some sci-fi novel, but for things I need for work or whatever. I'm not saying you should do it this way. There are lots of good ways to do things, but things like this fit with the techniques for memory that come out of the research that Southworth and Swyer are talking about.